Lulung, farewell to Li Duan. My old garden is filled with withered grass. About to leave, I am filled with sadness. My road leads off beyond cold clouds. Snow falls in the dusk as I take my leave. I was orphaned young and became a wanderer. In a life full of hardship, I met you late. Now, face to face, we can't stop tears. In a world of turmoil, where will we meet again? So this is the first poem, I believe, that we've read in this anthology of Lulun. There are a further 5 poems for a total of 6. Now, we've mentioned Lulun before while we were talking probably of Han Hong and maybe of Qian Qi. He is the most famous and the most representative of a group of poets that were generally branded together by later literary critics as the 10 great poets of the Dali era. Now, this is a group of poems, again, and poets, I've mentioned this about before, so I'll just be very brief. They're poets that write just after the An Lushan rebellion, but before the relative restoration of Tang power that takes place at the beginning of the 9th century. So basically, their time frame is the years that go from 756 to 800. Basically under emperors Taizong and Dezong. In fact, I think the first period of Emperor Dezong is the Dali era, which is the era that gives the name to these poets. And they were rather a bit like the Italian Manierists, that is to say, or that is what I've read. So they were technically proficient, very, very good craftsmen, coming in the wake of the great geniuses, of the great writers of the High Tang. But they were felt to be a bit shallow, a bit empty from the point of view of morality or of subject matter. Now, well, this would take us into a big detour. Remember, one of the main literary schools, one of the main interpretations of literature in classical China was based on the Confucian tradition. And the Confucian tradition and its texts tended to emphasize what we would call an expressivist, but also political and moral view of what literature is. It's encapsulated in a sentence from the Analects, I think, which is poetry expresses what's in the heart with intention. So, poetry is seen as an expression of inner feelings, but as opposed to a purely romantic view of expressing inner feelings, of expressing your heart. Very early on in the Confucian tradition, this was interpreted as political opinions, like the virtuous scholar official wants to criticize his ruler, wants to correct him, so he uses poetry, because poetry, is more indirect and aesthetic, and it has a greater possibility of influencing the ruler while not offending him. And, this was a staple fare during all of the imperial era, but this view of literature as subtle political criticism and remonstrance lasted for all of an imperial period, and Confucian scholars would always favor this interpretation of poetry and would smirk at what we would call poetry for poetry's sake, of a merely aestheticist view of poetry, which also did take place in different periods of Chinese history and in different writers. So here the main idea, the main reason why the Dali poets haven't fared very positively in later criticism is the accusation that they were empty from a moral or ethical point of view in their writing, as opposed to the generation that succeeded them, the mid-Tang poets like Bai Juji or Juan Chen, were poets, with a strong social conscience, who wrote poems about the abuses of the rich and powerful against the poor, a very Confucian topic. And some of the poets from the High Tang, I'm thinking especially of Du Fu, also had poetry of social concern. Okay, so back to Lulun, very briefly a biographical sketch. He is the main poet of the Dali era poets, some of which appear in this anthology. We've read them and we will be reading them. People like Sikong Shu, Qiang Qi, or Han Hong, among others. He didn't have a very impressive political career, so he mainly thrived in the aftermath of the An Lushan rebellion and mostly depended on private patrons, and his success and his positionings waxed and waned depending on the fortunes of his patrons. Only late in life was he called by Emperor Tedzung to court, probably because he had already forged a good reputation for himself as a poet by then. And in his last years, he was at the capital in minor postings like the Imperial Library and so on. I've read conflicting views on whether he passed the Jinshi examinations or not. So that's not particularly relevant, but it is significant that after the An Lushan rebellion, many important positions in government no longer depended on passing the examinations. There are other methods like working in the Salt Commission or serving a local military governor, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this poem, Lulung. This is a typical poem. The subject matter, as you probably have already noted when we read the poem, is parting, which is the staple fare, the most conventional, or one of the most conventional topics for Chinese poetry by scholar officials. Yeah, and we've already explained the social character of this type of poetry, and this is one of the main social events for which a scholar official writes a poem. He has to go away in exile or to govern a remote province sent by the state. He has a farewell party with other scholar officials at the capital or wherever they are. And this is always, these poems are all the same. They're generally sad, melancholy, lamenting the passage of time, the separation, probably overemphasizing the relationship between the person who is leaving or the composer of the poem and the other people. This is a farewell to Li Duan. Li Duan is, I think he is also one of the Dali era poets. He is included in this anthology. We will find him later. I think he has a pentasyllabic quatrain on the thither, on the chin. So here Lulun is saying goodbye to Li Duan. He's probably going to some sort of posting or sinecure in the provinces. So the topic, parting from friends, and it heaps up all the sad, melancholy images that would emphasize, that would intensify the sadness of parting. This is also very typical in a Chinese poem. If you have a poem on parting, you get the background description, generally autumn or winter, the saddest, most melancholy season of the year, probably nightfall, the saddest part of the day, probably a background of sad nature, like withered plants, crying animals. And I think this plays out quite clearly in this poem. You could say that perhaps a sub-theme, although it's not very explicit, might be lamentation at the ravages of war and at the general chaos that followed the An Lushan rebellion, especially before the restoration, the relative restoration that took place in the first 20 or so years of the 9th century. This was a time of chaos. The An Lushan rebellion was officially put down, like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years after it had started, but in practice it lasted much, much, much longer. And even after it was, even after the main military campaigns were over and there was no threat of the deposal of the Tang dynasty, the country was ravaged by war and devastation. Many, many, many provinces, especially in the north, had completely slipped away, some of them forever, from central government rule, and foreign barbarian pressure was heaped up on the capital area, with Tibetans and Uyghurs sometimes invading and sacking the capital, Chang'an. So it was a very chaotic age, which is very aptly described in the last line of this poem as a world of turmoil. Okay then, so as usual, let's go couplet by couplet. First couplet. My old garden is filled with withered grass. About to leave, I am filled with sadness. So the first couplet, as usual, sets the background, and it sets a pretty dark background with the images. So the poet is going to leave, and he is sad. This sadness is emphasized by the physical space he is leaving from. So, old garden, withered grass. So it's probably autumn or winter. His garden could be described in many ways, but the focus is on images of old age, on withering, on devastation. The garden is described as old, and old age is never a nice thing for Chinese scholar officials in their poetry. It's always something they lament. You could imagine they could appreciate the wisdom that comes from old age, but no. And withered grass, the poet's soul, the poet's heart might feel withered like the grass. So the things he sees and underlines evoke the feelings that he is feeling inside. He is feeling old and withered and sad. Second couplet. So the first couplet was before leaving, focusing on his garden and on his feelings. Second couplet, my road leads off beyond cold clouds. Snow falls in the dusk as I take my leave. So it's the dusk. It's the saddest part of the day, just as the day dies, just as the day ends. It's snowing, which is cold. So cold is the main feeling, the main adjective for this couplet. Coldness, the coldness of, the physical coldness coming from snow and cold clouds high up in the heavens, and then the path that the poet is supposed to take. But it's also an inner coldness, a spiritual coldness, a feeling sad, cold, at having to leave the warm friendships like Li Duan's, which he has to leave behind at the capital, probably. He has to go off. Now the focus is not on where he is now, his house, his garden, capital. Rather, it's on the road that has to be taken and that, passes through beyond cold clouds. It's very far and high away. Third couplet. Now, the third couplet moves from the present situation and the traveling image to, a little bit of Lulun's background and his relationship with Li Duan. So you could say the second part of the poem, the last two couplets, move into the more subjective, into the more personal relationship between Lulun and Li Duan, and more concrete, more specific feelings than just the general sadness at parting. I was orphaned young and became a wanderer. In a life full of hardship, I met you late. So this is really biographical, and we know that Lulun indeed was orphaned very young. We know that, he had to travel he in different positions through the empire, so he would qualify, as a wanderer. The hardships of his life, that would be a more relative thing, or more subjective point. But, he meets Li Duan relatively late in his life. So, he's saying, I've had a hard life, and only lately have I been able to meet with you. So there's the poignancy, the sadness of, after having suffering a lot, I got some relief by meeting you, but now I have to say goodbye to you. And the last couplet synthesizes the emotion of the whole poem and the tone of the whole poem in the image of Lulun and his friend crying, which is generally the pinnacle, the ecstatic or point of the magnification of sadness in these typical poems about parting between scholars, which generally end up with poets crying and with tears wetting the sleeves. Now, face to face, we can't stop tears. In a world of turmoil, where will we meet again? So we have the typical image of the poets, of the friends crying at their departure, and we end up with a rhetorical question, when shall we meet again? Which is, not purely rhetorical. Remember, life expectancy in China was not what it is today. The distances were enormous, so it was perfectly possible for a scholar official going off on a provincial duty never to come back again, or even if he came back to the capital, never to meet another scholar official with whom he had spent time there, because the other official could have died or could have been destined to some faraway province or territory. So the poem ends again with this poignant image of tears and of asking if there will be a reunion in the future for friends. So quite a stereotypical poem. I think in from that point of view, it does match the general stereotypes about Dali era poetry, but it does have some feeling, subjective, personal feeling, not political concern in this poem. Although you could say that, this last line pointing at troubled times, the world in turmoil, is an indirect reference to the chaos of the An Lushan rebellion.